Never judge or bully someone because of their weird mannerisms, because they might have developed those habits due to narcissistic abuse. Narcissistic abuse can leave people feeling anxious, insecure, and on edge. The way they react or express themselves might seem odd to outsiders. But it's important to remember that these mannerisms are often coping mechanisms shaped by their experiences. Today, we'll take a closer look at some of these peculiar habits, what they mean, and how understanding them can help us support those who've been through so much, including yourself. Are you ready for number 1? Pausing mid-sentence. When you've been through narcissistic abuse, you might catch yourself pausing mid-sentence, almost like you're unsure if what you're saying makes sense, or if it's even okay to say it. It happens because during the abuse, you were often made to feel like your thoughts or feelings weren't valid, so now you hesitate. Psychologist Dr. Ramani Dovasala explains that narcissists warp your reality, leaving you questioning yourself even in the smallest conversations. It's like you've been trained to second-guess everything, which is why these pauses happen, even when you know what you want to say. Listen closely. Consciously remind yourself that your thoughts and feelings are valid and practice expressing them confidently, even if it feels uncomfortable at first. Let's talk about number 2. Nervous laughter during uncomfortable situations. Narcissistic abuse survivors' bodies and minds adapt in strange ways, like using nervous laughter when things get uncomfortable. It's almost like a defense mechanism, their brain's way of diffusing tension. Psychologist Dr. Albert Ellis talked about how our reactions often come from a place of deeply rooted emotions and experiences. So, instead of showing fear or frustration, they laugh, even if it feels out of place. It's their mind trying to protect them from the discomfort. If you're doing this weird mannerism, let me teach you something. Cultivate self-awareness by recognizing the trigger for your laughter. Consciously practice responding with a more authentic expression of your feelings, such as calmly stating your discomfort or concern. Let's move on to number 3. Nervously repeating phrases. You might notice that some survivors of narcissistic abuse have this strange habit of nervously repeating phrases. They're trying to convince themselves or make sure they're saying the right thing. It can happen because they've been in situations where their words were twisted or used against them. So now they're double-checking to feel safe and secure. As therapist Dr. Les Carter says, narcissistic abuse often leaves survivors second-guessing themselves. It's a way for them to regain a sense of control over their communication and to reassure themselves that they're being heard and understood. So, if you catch someone doing this, remember, it's more than just a quirk. It's a part of their journey to rebuild their confidence after going through something tough. Now, let's continue to number 4. Speaking very quickly. Narcissistic abuse survivors tend to speak quickly, almost like they're racing against the clock. It often happens because they're worried about being cut off or not being heard. It's a common feeling after being around someone who invalidates your thoughts and feelings. Psychologist Dr. Gabor Mate says that trauma can lead to a heightened sense of urgency, making you feel like you have to rush your words to get your point across. It's your way of trying to protect yourself from feeling dismissed or overlooked again. Remember this: it's okay to slow down and take your time. Your voice deserves to be heard. You shouldn't miss number 5. Refusing to take up space. If you've experienced narcissistic abuse, you might find yourself refusing to take up space, like sitting in corners or making yourself small. This behavior often stems from feeling unworthy or invisible, a feeling that can be deeply ingrained after being belittled or dismissed by someone you trusted. Dr. Brené Brown talks about how shame can make us feel like we don't deserve to take up space or be seen. So, when you shrink away, it's often a protective mechanism, keeping you safe from potential judgment or rejection. Keep this in mind. You have every right to be present and take up space. Your feelings and existence matter. Are you still up for number 6? Over-checking their phone. Narcissistic abuse survivors constantly check their phones. They're always bracing themselves for bad news or rejection. It comes from the anxiety that the abuse created, where they were often criticized, ignored, or manipulated. Psychotherapist Beverly Engel explains that survivors of abuse can become hypervigilant, always expecting the worst, because that's what they were conditioned to believe. They always want to be prepared for any disappointment or hurt, even though it's exhausting. If you're doing this weird mannerism, take note of this. Set specific intervals for checking notifications and engage in grounding activities that redirect your focus to the present moment. It will reduce your anxiety about potential bad news. Let's keep it moving to number 7. Micromanaging their tone. If you've been through narcissistic abuse, you might find yourself constantly micromanaging your tone. You do this because you're trying hard not to sound harsh or aggressive. You've been conditioned to worry about how others perceive you and faced criticism for speaking your mind before. Psychologist Dr. Lisa Firestone explains that survivors often become overly cautious in their communication as a way to avoid conflict and keep themselves safe. So, you may catch yourself softening your words or second-guessing how you say things because you fear that you might upset someone. Listen closely. It's important to remember that your voice deserves to be heard just as it is. Your feelings and opinions are valid, and you don't always have to walk on eggshells. Here comes number 8. Over-preparing for simple tasks. Narcissistic abuse survivors tend to over-prepare for even the simplest tasks, feeling like they have to be ready for anything. It often comes from a deep-rooted fear of failing or being criticized, which they have faced repeatedly during the abuse. Life coach Dr. Nicole LaPera talks about how this kind of over-preparation is a way to protect survivors from potential rejection or judgment. So, whether it's rehearsing what to say in a conversation or double-checking their work way too many times, it's their mind's way of trying to keep them safe. Just remember, it's okay to be human and make mistakes. We don't always have to have everything figured out. Moving on to number 9. Suddenly withdrawing from conversations when feeling overwhelmed. If you've experienced narcissistic abuse, you might suddenly find yourself withdrawing from conversations when things get too overwhelming. It often happens because your brain is trying to protect you from emotional distress, especially if you've been in situations where your feelings were dismissed or manipulated. Psychologist Dr. Jonas Webb explains that this withdrawal is often a protective mechanism to cope with stress or anxiety. So, when you pull back, it's not because you don't care. It's your way of coping and regaining some control over the situation. Take note of this. It's perfectly okay to take a step back when you need to. Your feelings matter. Finally, we're down to number 10. Nervous throat clearing. You might notice that some survivors of narcissistic abuse clear their throats a lot. They're trying to shake off a nervous feeling or make their voices sound more steady. This habit can be a sign that they're still grappling with the effects of their past experiences. They might have felt their voice didn't matter, or that they had to be perfect to be heard. As Dr. Ramane Dovasula points out, survivors often struggle with self-expression because they've been silenced for so long. If you're doing this weird mannerism, consider this tip. Practice deep breathing and vocal exercises to build confidence in your voice. It allows you to express yourself without needing to mask your anxiety. Understanding the weird mannerisms of narcissistic abuse survivors is a step toward empathy and compassion. Just like everyone has their quirks, survivors have developed ways to cope with their past experiences. If you or someone you know is dealing with these quirks, remember that it's okay to take your time in healing. It's a journey, and everyone moves at their own pace. Be gentle with yourself and those around you. And who knows? Maybe these weird habits can even spark a deeper conversation about resilience and healing. After all, isn't it fascinating how our experiences shape us in unexpected ways?